reflected in the succession of weeks and their days from that time to the present. In spite of all of our dickerings with the calendar, it is patent that the human race never lost the septenary, 7-day sequence of weekdays, and that the Sabbath of these latter times comes down to us from Adam through the ages without a single lapse. And another one, it says, the continuity of the week has crossed the centuries and all known calendars still intact. Another one, it is a strange fact that even today there is a great deal of confusion concerning the question of so-called lost time. Alterations that have been made to the calendar in the past have left the impression that time has actually been lost. In point of fact, of course, these adjustments were made to bring the calendar into closer agreement with the natural solar year. Now, unfortunately, this supposed lost time is still being used to throw doubt upon the unbroken cycle of the seventh day, Sabbath, that God inaugurated at the creation. I am glad I can add the witness of my scientific training to the irrevocable nature of the weekly cycle. Having been time computer at Greenwich, England Observatory for many years, I can testify that all our days are in God's absolute control, relentlessly measured by the daily rotation of the earth on its axis. This daily period of rotation does not vary 1,000th part of a second in 1,000 years. Also, the year is a very definite number of days. Consequently, it can be said that not a day has been lost since creation, and all the calendar changes notwithstanding, there has been no break in the weekly cycle. Another one, it says, the week is a period of 7 days, having no reference whatever to the celestial motions, a circumstance to which it owes its unalterable uniformity. It has been employed from time immemorial in almost all Eastern countries, and is as it forms neither an aliquot part of the year nor the lunar month, those who reject the Mosaic recital will be at a loss, as D'Alembert remarks, to assign it to an origin having such semblance of possibility. And another one, it says, nay, farther, the multitude of mankind itself have had a great inclination of a long time to follow our religious observances, for there is not any city of the Grecians, nor any of the barbarians, nor any nation whatsoever, whither our custom of resting on the seventh day hath not come. That was from Josephus. So here we find that the weekly cycle has not been broken. We have many, many accounts, many historians telling us that there has never been a break whatsoever in the weekly cycle. The changes, all the changes to the calendar had nothing to do with changing the weekly cycle. So the evidence is overwhelming, friends. I'd like to point out some of the things we have found from our look at history, some of the conclusions we can come to. Number one, counting the Sabbath by the moon is unreliable. This is just an observation that I've noticed. Counting the Sabbath by the moon is very unreliable. Just the other day, the half moon, which is supposed to be the most reliable indicator, on October 18th, 2007, was at 44%, and the following day it was 54%. But I could not tell the difference. I wouldn't have been able to tell you which day was supposed to be the 8th day of the month. And yet this is what's supposed to be used to tell you when the Sabbath is. And this is supposed to be the most accurate. The full moon can last for 4 days. It'll look like it's full for 4 days in a row. How do you know which day is supposed to be the Sabbath? If you're just looking at the moon, it's a very unreliable manner of doing it. If you're waiting for the new moon, seeing the new moon crescent is very difficult. The new moon crescent it comes right at sundown. Right as the sun goes down, the new moon crescent is there, and it goes down also. So there's only a brief time where you can see that new moon crescent. And another point on this, I once recently was talking to a friend of mine in California who keeps the Sabbath according to the moon, and he told me of a conversation he had with another friend of his in Florida who keeps the Sabbath according to the moon, and they were talking to one another, and they found that they were keeping the Sabbath on a different day. One was said, "Happy Sabbath," and the other said, what are you talking about? Today's not the Sabbath. So they were both observing the moon and came to a different day. Now think about this. The moon is unreliable to tell you. If we were to count the Sabbath by the moon, you could come within a few days of it, but it would be unlikely to catch the Sabbath day every month of every year. So another point here, sometimes the lapse between a half moon and a full moon, and then a half moon, is 6 days, and sometimes it's 8 days. It's a very unreliable manner to keep the Sabbath. And if you count the new moon by the visible crescent, then you'll have the half moon on day 5 or 6 of the month. And this is the way the Jews counted the new moon, was by the visible crescent back at Christ's time. And so this is not the way the Sabbath was ever counted. Let's go to the next conclusion that we can find. The historical evidence in favor of a lunar Sabbath is very unreliable. We noticed that when we looked at some of these quotes. We look at the context, we look at what they're saying, we find we can't trust these accounts. They're not reliable sources. For the same encyclopedias that uphold the idea that the Sabbath was originally connected to the moon, they also say that they do not know where the Sabbath came from, and it probably was adopted from pagans. Can't trust that source as reliable. Conclusion number 3, the controversy over the day to keep Pentecost proves that the Sabbath could not have been connected to the lunar cycle. Okay, conclusion number 4, there is no instruction anywhere in the Bible that we should keep the Sabbath by observing the moon. Instead, when teaching the Jews, God used manna to teach them. He never told them to look at the moon. Conclusion number 5, there is abundant evidence that the planetary week has been in use for thousands of years, and that the day of Saturn has always coincided with the weekly Sabbath. So this is very strong evidence. Another one, conclusion number 6, there have been several calendar changes in history, but none of them have affected the weekly cycle of the Jews. Conclusion number 7, all recorded changes to the Jewish calendar revolved around the Sabbath to guarantee its continuity. Now I want you to point out something on that. The Enoch calendar, we mentioned just a little bit, the Enoch calendar, which is also mentioned in the book of Jubilees, is a 364-day calendar. And the reason for proposing that 364-day calendar was to cause the feast days to equal the days of the week, which proves that they did not keep a lunar calendar, a lunar-based Sabbath at that time. They had a lunar calendar, but they did not base the Sabbath on the lunar calendar. They based the Sabbath on a continual unbroken cycle. And the fact that they would change any changes to the Jewish calendar that have ever been done or even proposed have revolved around the Sabbath to keep the Sabbath intact. Today they determine the new year. Their year starts based upon the Sabbath. So they never had a calendar that determined the Sabbath, but rather the Sabbath determined the calendar. That's conclusion number 8. And conclusion number 9, we see that the 8-day calendar of the Romans did not interfere with the continuity of the 7-day weekly cycle. The 7-day weekly cycle existed before the change and after the change that the Constantine did in 321 AD. It had nothing to do, it had no change whatsoever on the 7-day cycle. There are a multitude of witnesses that the weekly cycle was not determined by the moon, and that the Jewish calendar dates can fall on any day of the week. These witnesses include the documents of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the writings of unbiased secular historians, and most importantly, the Bible itself. We have seen in the Bible that the Sabbath can fall on any day of the week. Now, conclusion number 11. Every eyewitness account that I know of from anyone living during the time of Christ and the apostles that gives us any clue regarding the timing of the weekly Sabbath in use at that time claim that it was equivalent to the day the pagans call the day of Saturn, Saturday. Conclusion number 12. The laws of postponements in the Mishnah during the lifetime of Christ prove that they were keeping a continually